Chapter 1. When Stars Were Still Safe. It had been 11 years since John Maverick first stepped onto the soils of Solari Prime, back when the red and blue gas giant still hung untouched above the sky, and the planet below teemed with bioluminescent flora and gentle winds like songs whispered through coral trees. He had arrived there by mistake, his battered freighter forced to land for emergency repairs, but what started as an unplanned stop turned into something much more permanent. After everything he had endured in the collapsing Outer Rim Wars, after the atrocities on Ferrix 4 and the failed peace treaties that shattered the last standing remnants of human authority, John found that his scars, both mental and physical, itched a little less when he sat by the silvery lakes of Solari and watched the glowing fish swirl like galaxies in water. There was peace here, fragile and precious, and for a while, he believed he had finally outrun the chaos of the stars. The settlement was small, barely 200 people when he first arrived, mostly Safiri refugees, gentle beings with elongated limbs, smooth skin shimmering like polished marble, and expressive eyes that mirrored emotion like glassy mirrors. They were once engineers, architects, and biologists of the 13 cluster before the purging fleets burned their cities and declared them non-contributing species. The surviving few had drifted, scattered among the void, until planets like Solari offered them sanctuary. John hadn't meant to stay. He never meant to settle anywhere. But something about the way the Safiri children looked at him, not with suspicion like most Outerworlders, but with wonder, had softened something inside him. He found purpose teaching them how to work with metals, rebuild hydrocores, and reinforce their perimeter systems. He repaired wind turbines, repurposed fallen shuttles, and taught younglings how to disassemble malfunctioning generators without losing fingers. And among those younglings was a tiny, bold spark of light named Talivex. Tali was a curious creature, all enormous lavender eyes, soft downy fur of an unusually pale silver hue, and a voice that carried a hint of melody whenever she spoke. While most of the Safiri children observed him from afar with polite curiosity, Tali marched up to him the very first week, hands on hips, tail stiff with confidence, and demanded to know what coffee tasted like and whether human teeth were actually made of bone. She was 7 by their count, though with the age conversion charts John had scratched together from Safiri genetics data, he guessed she'd be around 5 in human terms. She stuck to him like a magnetic field, asking, watching, mimicking. She shadowed him as he replaced antennae on rooftops and begged to help weld scrap metal when they worked on the outer gates. John, who had once led entire units of hardened shock troopers across battle-scarred moons, now found himself showing a tiny alien how to properly hold a wrench and not arc a circuit into her fur. He never expected to laugh again the way he did with her. And she, bright, eager, innocent, never left his side for long. She made fun of how slow he walked, teased his terrible alien pronunciation, and declared herself official apprentice to the great human John of the universe. It became a running joke among the other settlers, the old soldier with a pint-sized alien shadow, and John began to feel something warm and terrifying: hope. One evening, as the twin moons of Solari dipped low over the glowing treetop canopies, and the settlement lights hummed with steady rhythm, Tali and John sat on the edge of a rooftop, munching on dried fruits and rehydrated mushroom slices. She had managed to rewire an old light beacon that week, and he'd rewarded her with a real Earth chocolate bar her first. She ate it slowly, like it was sacred. "I want to visit your Earth one day," she said softly, chewing thoughtfully. "Do you think the oceans are really that big?" "They were," John replied, voice tinged with old memories, "before they turned half of them into algae farms and industrial desalination pools. But yeah, they were big. Real big." Tali turned toward him, eyes wide. "When I grow up," she declared, "I'm going to fly my own cruiser, go to Earth, and then come back and marry you. You'll see." John nearly choked on his fruit, letting out a startled laugh that echoed across the rooftop. "That's so," he teased. "Guess I better prepare a ring big enough for a Safiri queen, huh?" She beamed. "A necklace. We don't do rings, silly human. And it better glow." That was Tali, direct, bold, filled with dreams too big for her tiny frame. And John, amused and fond, patted her head and made a promise that he never imagined would follow him through time. "All right, kiddo. You grow up and build a cruiser, come find me. And if you're still sure, we'll talk marriage." She grinned, tail twitching happily. It's a pact. But promises, even silly ones, carry strange power when made under starlight. The years passed with deceptive calm. John continued to rebuild Solari's infrastructure. The settlement grew, new arrivals came, crops improved, and old abandoned stations were turned into libraries and hydroponic domes. Tali grew too fast. Her species matured rapidly in stages, and by the time she reached the equivalent of a teenage phase, she was already taller than John's chest and more skilled at drone maintenance than any of the adults. But then the war came. It always does. The Outer Dominion declared Solari strategically valuable, claiming rights over its natural underground energy cores. When the Sefiri refused to surrender sovereignty, orbital bombardments began without warning. The skies rained fire and shrapnel. John fought, as he always had, rallying the settlers, coordinating evacuations, manually piloting escape crafts loaded with younglings. Tali's mother was gravely wounded during a failed counteroffensive near the eastern ridge, and John remembered the way her hands trembled as she pressed her daughter into his arms. "Take her," she gasped, breath rattling, blood soaking the ground. "Promise me keep her safe." But the overcrowded evacuation pod they were assigned to was hit moments after launch. Fires engulfed the midsection. John had shoved Tali into a sealed supply compartment, screaming for her to stay quiet, as he sealed the hatch from the outside and activated its auto-drop module. He watched it plummet toward the forest canopy below, then everything went white. When John woke up, it was weeks later. A hospital on Cytherian 9. Partial memory loss. Shrapnel embedded near his spine. He'd been found near the edge of a burning crater, barely alive, dragged out by scavenger teams looking for survivors. Of Tali no word. Of Solari destroyed. He searched as much as he could, put in requests through border world databanks, reached out to Sefiri embassies, scoured refugee rosters, even bribed officials in low-orbit colonies. Nothing. Just a name on a lost list. Tali Vex, presumed dead. Like so many others. So he stopped searching. Years passed again. John's body aged with increasing stubbornness. He settled into another Outer Rim colony, Callister's Edge, a quiet industrial port planet rich in salvage tech, forgotten by most of the war. He ran a small shop there, fixing old droids and worn-out shielding. People still called him Sarge, even though he hadn't worn armor in over a decade. He drank too much, kept to himself, and tried not to think about lavender eyes and rooftop promises. Until the night the storm ship landed. It was unregistered, a sleek black cruiser with glowing veins of silver and no faction insignia. It came down silent, elegant, and uninvited. John was already reaching for his old rifle when the ship opened, and a tall figure descended. She wore armor lined with humming circuits and moved with the silent grace of a predator. But her eyes, those eyes stopped him cold. Lavender. Familiar. Burning. "Tali," he whispered, disbelieving. She smiled, something fierce and radiant in it. "Hello, John," she said, voice lower, mature, tinged with something deeper than just memory. "I've come to collect on a promise." John didn't move. He couldn't. His fingers, still loosely gripping the rusted handle of the half-rebuilt servobot beside him, slowly curled into a fist. His brain, wired by a lifetime of caution, suspicion, and the trauma of war, screamed for him to analyze this moment, look for trickery, scan for threats. But his heart betrayed all logic. Because that voice, even though it had deepened with the gravity of adulthood and space travel, still carried the unmistakable trill of youthful stubbornness he hadn't heard in over a decade. It wasn't just resemblance. It was her. Tali Vex. He stood up slowly, knees popping from age and misuse, eyes never leaving her silhouette as she approached. Her posture was different now, upright and confident. The girl who once tripped over exposed wires and laughed like a comet storm now moved with the precision of someone trained for war and survival. Her armor was not merely decorative. It bore subtle scratches from deflected blasts, and her boots had walked through fire. But her eyes softened when they settled on him. "I thought you were dead," he finally said, voice low, almost hoarse. "I was," she replied, stopping just a meter from him. "For 3 years, I was presumed lost on a moon fragment orbiting Veilgar Minor. The escape module you shoved me into landed hard. Cracked my leg. No comms. No food for 2 weeks. I survived by gutting a cave lizard with a shard of hull metal and waiting for the Federation scavengers to pass by. He swallowed. You were 7. I was Safiri, she replied evenly. We adapt or we die, and I had to survive. Because I remembered something. A promise. John winced. Tell me about that. It was a joke. She tilted her head. Not to me. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind of Callister's edge carried dust down the alley, where John's shop door swung slightly in the breeze. His thoughts flitted through memories of starlit jokes, rooftop chocolates, and firestorms that tore their world apart. And now, standing before him, was a woman forged in the silence between memory and hope, one who had returned not just with her life, but with intent. I'm not here to bind you to a child's wish, she said at last, her voice gentler. I just wanted you to know I kept my end. I survived. I built a cruiser. I found you. That's what mattered. He stared at her for a long time. And now, Tali looked past him, at the tools scattered across the orc bench, the flickering holosign, and the battered relic of a war-weary man who'd given up hope of seeing his past return. Now, she said, I want to see if you remember how to dance under alien moons. Chapter 2. Old Wounds, New Worlds. The inside of her ship smelled faintly of rainstorms, anized air, polished synth wood, and the tang of old memories waiting to be stirred. John sat rigidly in the passenger seat of the cockpit, hands resting awkwardly on his knees, not knowing whether to comment on the curved silver architecture or the ridiculous fact that the tiny girl he once taught how to solder was now piloting a vessel that outclassed his entire planetary defense experience. Tali moved with practiced ease, fingers gliding over runes and input pads, speaking to the ship in a half-sung dialect he didn't recognize. You programmed your own AI interface? He asked. She nodded without looking at him. Modified an old Tyrellian song code. Turns out ancient sound patterns bond better with Safiri neural harmonics. He blinked. And you taught yourself that? She gave a small smile. What else was I going to do? I was alone for years. Solitude teaches more than teachers ever could. Besides, she glanced at him briefly. You told me to grow fast. That cut deeper than he expected. John looked out the viewport as the ship lifted from the Callister platform, hovering momentarily before breaking atmosphere in a streak of light. Stars scattered across the darkness above like ash from a cosmic fire. It had been so long since he'd ridden in anything sleek. His last trip had been on a mining hauler bound for parts salvage. This was freedom forged in metal and starlight. Tali, he began carefully, I need to know what this is. Why come back? Why find me after all this time? She leaned back in the pilot's seat, exhaling slowly, eyes on the stars. I wandered for years. Learning. Fighting. Searching. At first it was about surviving. Then it became about remembering. You gave me something no one else ever did, John. Safety. Laughter. A name that wasn't followed by a number or cage tag. And a promise, even if it was made in jest, meant something when everything else was burning. I didn't hold on to it because I expected a ceremony and wedding vows. I held on to it because it reminded me that someone once believed in me. Her voice trembled slightly, just once, and then solidified again. And now, you're the only thing left I haven't faced. He looked at her profile, the subtle elegance of her alien features matured and strong, and realized he had no clever retort, no sardonic remark to cloak the ache rising in his chest. Do you hate me? He asked suddenly. For not finding you? No, she said quietly. But I needed you to know how far I came for the idea of you. That's something no girl should ever have to do alone. Silence followed. The stars watched, indifferent. The cruiser broke into hyperspeed moments later, and John closed his eyes, not to rest but to shield himself from the weight of feelings too large for his war-battered heart. Tali reached over, her clawed fingers gently brushing his knuckles. We're not heading anywhere specific, she whispered. Just forward. You okay with that? He nodded, whispering, forward sounds good. And the stars blurred, and the past began to unravel behind them. The ship's core hummed with a rhythmic pulse, like the heartbeat of something ancient and alive. John sat in the softly lit lounge of the cruiser now, wrapped in the silence of his thoughts, while Tali, still alert and controlled, reviewed star maps and security reports from far-flung systems. The room was surprisingly warm, designed not just for functionality, but comfort. A glowing table in the center projected a slowly rotating map of their quadrant, stars twinkling like whispers of fate. John had been in dozens of ships in his life, but none that felt this alive. Not just because of the technology, it was something deeper. This ship bore the marks of its creator. It bore her. She'd done more than just survive. She had built a life, carved from ash and forgotten coordinates, and now carried that history on her back like a warrior queen in exile. Yet she had come back not for revenge, not for answers, but for a promise. A child's dream. A silly joke. And that haunted John more than anything. Because while she had grown into something greater, he had merely endured. A man hardened into rusted armor and creaking joints, whose greatest acts had long since passed into stories only drinkers in bar corners remembered. "You really kept it," he said aloud, half to himself. Tali looked over, arching one pale brow. "Kept what?" "The promise. The one I made without thinking. Just to make a little girl laugh." She tilted her head, brushing a few silver strands from her face. "Do you know what kept me going those first few months after the crash? I used to close my eyes and imagine your voice. Not what you said, but how you said it. Like the universe was still funny. Like it was still worth smiling in. You gave me something bigger than a joke. You gave me a direction." He wanted to reply, but the words didn't come. So he nodded instead, a slow, guilty gesture weighed down by years of loss. Later that night, while Tali slept in the captain's quarters and John wandered restlessly through the observation bay, he stood before the panoramic glass that framed the stars outside like frozen fireworks. In the reflection, he didn't see the old soldier anymore. He saw a man being asked to become something again, to be worthy of a journey, to matter. He whispered, "Why did I ever stop believing in anything?" And somewhere deep inside, a memory flickered of a tiny alien girl holding a wrench larger than her hand, declaring herself his apprentice with full certainty. Chapter 3, The Invitation. 2 weeks later, they touched down on Atheros, a lush, rain-wrapped moon draped in jungle vines and copper clouds, orbiting a dying orange star. The place was a relic world, populated only by scattered researchers and a few self-exiled philosophers from the Erudian order. Tali had brought them here not for supplies, but for something else, something ceremonial. "This is where we make oaths in my culture," she explained as they descended the vine-wrapped walkway. "Not like humans, with rings and papers. We share memory. Shared memory becomes binding." John blinked. "You mean like telepathy?" "More like entanglement of experience. You'll see." The ceremony grounds were inside an old crystal cavern, its walls glowing faintly with bioluminescent sigils that responded to thought. In the center, a basin of shimmering liquid memory rippled without touch. Tali stood barefoot beside it, armored robes shedding like petals from her frame until she wore only ceremonial wrappings, minimal, respectful, ancient. She looked at him, her expression calm. "You don't have to do this." "I know," he replied, undoing his jacket and stepping forward. They both reached for the basin and touched the surface at the same moment. In an instant, his mind was no longer alone. A rush of feelings and images slammed into his consciousness: her pain on the moon, the cold nights, the hunger that gnawed at her bones, the sound of distant thunderstorms while she carved symbols into cave walls just to remember his face. But it wasn't just pain, there was joy too. The moment she first flew a ship by herself. The time she found his name on a bounty hunter database, confirming he was alive. And beneath it all, like an unbreakable thread, her memory of him. Not as he saw himself, but as she had seen him back then. The laughing teacher. The one who made her feel safe. John staggered back from the basin, breath catching. "God." Tali stood before him, calm, tears on her cheeks. "Now you understand," she said. He nodded, because he did. He felt it all. And more than that, he knew that the promise had grown into something beyond mere words. They didn't kiss. They didn't embrace. Not yet. Instead, they stood beside one another in silence. Two people not returning to something old but stepping into something entirely new. Something neither war nor time had managed to erase. The silence that followed the memory binding was the kind that didn't need to be filled. John felt unmoored, as though something inside of him had been torn open and rewoven with threads he didn't know he still had. It wasn't just that he'd seen her pain and journey. It was that she had willingly shown it to him. There was a vulnerability in that kind of raw exposure, and yet she stood before him proud, not broken. She wasn't asking him to save her, she was asking him to see her. And he had. They exited the ceremonial cavern in the orange dawn light, both walking without words, each carrying the impression of the other's soul imprinted on their own. John had always thought of himself as too old, too broken, too wrapped in rust and regret to begin anything new. But what had unfolded inside the crystalline temple had undone decades of self-denial. In Tali's memories, he wasn't a failure or a relic, he was the axis around which a young girl's future had spun. Later, in the quiet warmth of the cruiser's upper lounge, they sat side by side sipping from steaming mugs of bitter herbal tea. Outside, Atheros slowly turned beneath them like an emerald eye half closed in sleep. "You don't owe me anything," John said at last, breaking the stillness. "You could have gone on with your life, built more ships, founded your own order. You didn't need to come back." Tali looked over at him, a faint smile tugging her lips. "And yet here I am. Because of a joke. Because of a promise. Because when the galaxy wanted me erased, you didn't look at me like a burden, you looked at me like someone worth saving." Her fingers reached out, covering his scarred hand. "Let's stop pretending this is just about a joke made long ago." John exhaled slowly, the weight on his chest lifting like a fog at sunrise. "Then what is it about?" She leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching his. "It's about what we do next." And John, who had seen countless stars and watched entire empires crumble, finally let himself imagine a future again with her in it. Chapter 4. What comes after the promise? 3 months passed. 3 quiet, vivid, real months that felt more like life than anything John had experienced in decades. He traveled with Tali to border worlds she helped defend, met settlements where her name was spoken with reverence as the engineer queen of the fractured belt, and saw firsthand how the girl he once taught to weld had become a legend among wandering peoples. She carried herself with dignity and compassion, and he quickly realized she wasn't just returning for him, she was building something bigger, a new alliance between lost peoples of the outer systems. And yet, every night, she came back to sit beside him. Every night, her head rested on his shoulder. And every night, she whispered stories of stars she wanted him to see. They never used the word marriage in the human sense. Among the Sefiri, the concept was different. 2 souls bound through memory sharing and companionship. No papers, no contracts, just commitment through deed and presence. They lived it, breath by breath, until one day she brought him to a world he'd never heard of before. Tesseril, a quiet moon with crystalline rivers and wind-hollowed stones that hummed with soft resonance. "Why here?" he asked as they stood atop a cliffside plateau, the sky painted in 3 colors of dusk. "Because this is where Sefiri share the future," she said simply. And she knelt unlike any human proposal and pressed her palm into the stone. A light flared, and beneath their feet, the surface responded with color and warmth. She looked up at him with glowing eyes. "Not because of a joke, not because of the past, but because I want you in what comes next." John swallowed hard, the wind brushing against him like a question waiting to be answered. "I was old," he murmured, "worn out, ready to disappear. But you found me. You brought me back." She rose and took his hand. "And now we walk forward together." He kissed her, then not urgently, not desperately, but gently, like someone who'd spent a lifetime forgetting how and now remembered exactly what it meant. From that day forward, they didn't dwell on what had been lost. They built instead. Together, they designed new kinds of ships that carried not weapons but seeds and dreams. Together, they rebuilt worlds one outpost at a time, proving that healing wasn't a myth, it was work, forged from 2 hands, 2 hearts, and 1 promise that had refused to die. Years later, when people asked how the great Talivex came to rule not just a cruiser, but an entire coalition of border worlds, she'd laugh and say, "It started with a chocolate bar and a foolish human who said he'd marry me when I grew up." And John, older but smiling, would simply add, "I was only half joking." They would walk away hand in hand, their past burned clean, their future limitless. Together, at last.